We see infatuation that perpetuates a delusion. She would rather someone die than let it go.
One of the most high-profile murder cases ever in Westchester County.
It's about sex, betrayal, obsession, and ultimately, rage.
This sordid affair that turns very ugly, very violent.
It seemed to fit just perfectly for the media to exploit.
This perfect couple with the perfect child, and the perfect home, and the perfect life. She needs this relationship to not end, but to continue in the way that she wants it to.
We see a need for absolute control.
Utilizing sex is going to keep this guy around, and it does.
You have this very attractive young woman. You have this relationship with a married man.
It's toxic, it's poisonous, it's deadly. She calls 911 and she's frantic. But you know what happens during that call? The line gets cut.
And that's where this case begins, with a savage, brutal, cold-hearted murder. So Paul and Betty Jeanne Soloman live in Westchester, New York. They've been married for 15 years. They're both fairly successful in their own careers. He's a teacher and she's an account executive at a credit company.
On the surface, Paul and Betty Jeanne have what could be considered an idyllic marriage. I mean, they have a kid, they have a house, white picket fence. And for a while, things are that American dream for them. Picture this day. Paul and Betty Jeanne.
They have the house to themselves because their beautiful teenage daughter has gone off on a skiing trip with her friends.
They're home. They're going through the retirement plans. They're talking about the future. They're looking at their idyllic life together in their latter years. They have sex. They grab a nice lunch, maybe a little bit of champagne together. And they're really celebrating the love they have for each other. And so that night, Paul decides, you know what? We've had this wonderful day, Betty Jeanne. And you know what? I think I want to go out and I want to go bowling. So he leaves.
From the outside, it appeared as if Paul and Betty Jeanne had a pretty great marriage. But Paul went bowling a lot, and that was a point of contention for their marriage. Betty Jeanne wasn't happy with that. And those who knew them on a more personal level would probably say that they were having marital problems. So even though Betty Jeanne wasn't happy about Paul going bowling again, he went anyway. He ended up leaving the house around 6:30 p.m.
Betty Jeanne, home alone.
She's sitting there in the house, a little annoyed at her husband, and then she hears something.
Somebody breaks in, pistol whips Betty Jeanne, beating her senseless, really.
On the evening of January 15th, 1989, a New York telephone operator received a call from an unknown woman in distress. The call was abruptly disconnected, which prompted the operator to alert police. Police were unable to locate the caller because the reverse directory had an incorrect address.
The call is disconnected and the police can't track her. Betty Jeanne's attempt to get help fails. Now she's trapped in the house with this intruder, and they take the gun that they beat her with and they start shooting.
This person takes the weapon and shoots her 9 times.
Betty Jeanne is beaten so badly and shot so many times in the back that she loses consciousness and she falls to the ground. Now she's lying in a pool of her own blood, and the intruder flees. There she is on the ground, bleeding, essentially dying. Paul Paul returns home from the bowling alley and he finds Betty Jean lying in a pool of her own blood.
Betty?
She's face down, so he turns her over, but she's unresponsive. So he calls 911.
How does an idyllic housewife, a mother, wind up dead?
6:30 p.m., he says goodbye to his wife and he leaves. Only 4.5 hours later, he returns and Betty Jean is dead. How horrific.
Somebody not only wanted Betty Jean dead and out of the picture, they wanted her to suffer.
This wasn't an execution. This was a brutal, brutal attack. Who could have done this? Who wanted Betty Jean dead?
You're always going to suspect the spouse when you see a case where the wife is murdered like this. I mean, that's always going to be something the police will focus on, naturally.
What we commonly see with homicides is that the victim and the killer know each other, and the spouse is typically among the first people to be interrogated by police. So police start asking Paul questions about where he was when the murder took place.
So they begin to ask him simple questions, but they get a inference from Paul that he's hiding something, that he's beating around the bush, that he cannot account for his time.
So flags are going up, alarms are going off. Why can't this guy tell police where he was? What's he hiding?
I look at Paul in general and I see that the guy is sketchy, he's wiry, it seems like he's lying. This guy has a lot to hide.
So immediately, police investigators want to know what's going on. What is this guy hiding? Did he kill his wife of 15 years?
Paul did lie to the police early on.
Police discovered that Paul was acting strangely because he did in fact have something to hide. He was having an affair.
We have this beautiful, warm-hearted, caring mother and wife. And she's found brutally pistol-whipped and shot 9 times inside her own home.
Westchester, it's a great place to live. It's just outside New York City. So you get all of the things that the city has to offer, but you still get to enjoy that suburban lifestyle. This happened in January. A lot of the houses still have their Christmas decorations up. There's snow on the ground. It's really a beautiful time in Westchester. But when a murder like this happens, it really rocks the community.
Betty Jeanne Soloman was discovered by her husband Paul at 11:47 p.m. after he returned home from the bowling alley. He frantically called 911 for help. Unfortunately, he was too late. Betty Jeanne Soloman was already dead.
So when I look at a home invasion like that, the first word that comes to mind is overkill. You know, you pistol whip somebody and then you shoot him not once in the back of the head. You shoot him 9 times. There is hatred, there is anger all over this crime. The suspicion immediately goes to the husband. So what do you do next? You sit Paul in a chair and you start talking to him.
What police find when they're interrogating Paul is that he's clearly hiding something.
Was he bowling or was he not bowling? Or maybe was Paul with his mistress that night?
Earlier on in the evening, the night that Betty Jeanne Soloman was murdered, he said he was bowling at the time, and he was with Carolyn Warbus.
Carolyn Warmus was Paul's colleague and a fellow teacher at Greenville Elementary in Scarsdale, New York. She went to Columbia University and also completed a master's degree in education before beginning her career as a computer science teacher at the school where she first met Paul.
She's beautiful. She comes from money. Her father is a Michigan-based businessman worth an estimated $150 million. So she comes from a life of privilege. Her education is paid for, and so is her apartment in Manhattan. She meets Paul. He's a 6th grade teacher. They hit it off almost immediately and start dating. But there's a problem. Paul is a married man, but she doesn't seem to think there's a problem with dating a married man.
Well, when I find out that he has a mistress, boom, red flag.
So Paul and Carolyn date for a long time, well over a year. And Betty Jean had her suspicions. She felt that when he went to the bowling alley, he was probably going to see his mistress. And she was right. So you could see that they had some issues in their marriage. In 1987, Paul is a 6th grade teacher in his 40s, and Carolyn Warmus is a new computer science teacher in her 20s at his school. She's gorgeous and just really turns his head.
Paul and Carolyn, I think, were teaching at the same school district in Westchester County. They were colleagues.
They begin to talk, and they begin to realize there's some sparks there.
Flirting going on. They were touching and laughing, obvious chemistry. And they decided to take their relationship outside of the school, so they decided to go for some drinks with some other teachers. But I think they all knew there was more going on here.
They decide to meet at this bar, and when Carolyn shows up at the bar, Paul is there by himself. So Carolyn, of course, walks up to him, and they begin a conversation, and sparks turn into lust.
One thing led to another, and they began to have an affair.
At this point, the heat is on, so they start having sex. Sex everywhere. In their cars, in the parking lot, anywhere they can get it. But here's where the water gets really murky. Paul had taken out life insurance on Betty Jean just before she was murdered. When you start to look at a motive in this case, things just don't add up. Carolyn comes from money, so she doesn't really need the insurance payout. And you'd think that if Paul needed the money, he could just ask his rich girlfriend. So things are just not adding up. Is Paul's affair with Carolyn the only thing he's hiding, or is there more going on here?
Paul Soloman initially was a suspect. He did take insurance out on his wife's life. He was having this affair with Carolyn Warmus for a long time. I mean, it wasn't just a brief affair, it was over a year.
You have to ask, did Paul hire someone to murder his wife?
Was he trying to get rid of Betty Jean? Maybe. I mean, they'd been having issues in their marriage for some time, and in walks this beautiful, gorgeous woman who's willing to have sex with him anywhere, anytime. So maybe he just decided that he wanted to be with Carolyn instead.
Carolyn maintains this fantasy of hers in which she could possibly be in denial. Because why would they have to sneak around into seedy hotels? Why would they have to have sex in his car, in her car? Why wouldn't they be at his house living a life that a boyfriend and girlfriend would lead?
This wasn't a relationship that was out in the open. It was an affair. So the newness, the sneaking around must have been exciting for Paul, especially after being married to Betty Jean for 15 years.
I know that at some point she knew that Paul was married, and Paul told her that he was going to get divorced in a couple of years.
It was allegedly agreed that Paul would leave Betty Jean when his daughter Kristen graduated high school. Either way, Carolyn was having an affair with a married man, so clearly boundaries were crossed.
What is it about Carolyn that makes her choose men that are unavailable? Does she like it? Is she getting a high off it? That adrenaline rush?
She grew up in a wealthy household. She got a college degree and a master's degree in education.
We're talking about a well-educated, smart person.
A very talented, well-liked, affluent individual.
Carolyn's parents divorced when she was 8. Her dad practically ran off with the secretary. So from a very young age, she was exposed to infidelity and had developed some serious trust issues.
When we look at someone like that, from the upbringing, we don't expect them to do things later that cause our eyebrows to raise and our mouths to drop open.
She lived with her dad and his new wife for a while, and even though they were wealthy, it didn't mean that it was always smooth sailing. Her new stepmother felt like she was in competition with Carolyn over her dad's attention. And from a young age, she fell into this pattern of obsessive, competitive relationships over men.
There was a series of relationships where it seemed that she was aggressively involved with men. There were stories way back about her getting involved with some men and maybe even stalking some men.
We have a woman, when she gets involved with men, becomes obsessive. I mean, when I say obsessive, I don't use that term loosely. I mean like violently obsessive. She cannot take rejection of any kind. Someone breaks up with her, she becomes obsessed. She tries everything, right? She tries to follow the guy. She tries to find out what the guy's doing. It's like every time she meets someone and something goes wrong, her obsessive nature takes over, and her type A personality is driving all of this. Her narcissism is driving all of this, and she just can't tell the guy, "You're a scumbag. Get out of my life." Why? Because she has low self-esteem.
After a breakup, Carolyn would relentlessly use money to try and win back that relationship. It was like having to deal with everything she grew up as a child with all over again. It's kind of like Cinderella, where the stepmother moves in and poor Cinderella is continuously and constantly neglected. Carolyn can't stand the idea of being left by another man like her father left her.
There were incidents where she did use her resources, her wealth, to hire private investigators to locate certain individuals.
So there's one instance where Carolyn met this bartender. She starts having, wild sex with him. Anywhere, anyway, every day.
They break up and Carolyn goes off the rails. She tries all her usual tactics to win him back, to no avail.
None of that works. What does she do? She hires a private detective to follow him.
This is where Carolyn's emotional baggage from her childhood really starts to rear its ugly head, and we start to see something serious unfolding.
When I look at private investigators, there's kind of two schools. There's the old school Columbo type who is out there trying to make good, trying to help people of the missing, trying to solve cold cases, that sort of thing. But then there's these reality type, Hollywood type guys, right? Who you hire to do your dirty work for you, to take pictures, right? Compromising photographs of other people, to follow people, to plant stuff, to get the dirt on people. She hires a private investigator, but not to track this guy's movements. No, to set this guy up. So he can take pictures of this guy with other women so she can then what? Show his wife. So in her fantasy world, the wife divorces him and she gets all of him.
Not surprisingly, the relationship with the bartender didn't work out. But what happened in the process is she started to form a relationship with the PI, Vincent 𝗠𝗂𝗿𝗏. She carried on a relationship with him on and off for a few years. But Vincent 𝗠𝗂𝗏𝗏 was also married. Another twist. Her affair with him was going on at the same time as her affair with Paul Soloman.
Paul allegedly was sleeping with other teachers also. We have this playboy elementary school teacher who's sleeping around.
Paul has multiple sexual partners, and Carolyn has multiple sexual partners, so we're starting to see that there's potentially a lot of people involved in this situation.
Again, it's a big open question here that does raise factual questions about the identity of the killer.
As the case grows, the suspect pool grows with it. So many suspects, so little time.
So here's what we know about Betty Jeanne Soloman. She's the mother of a teenage daughter, married to an elementary school teacher, but her husband is having an affair, and she's attacked and murdered in her own home.
You know, even though Paul's wife has been brutally slain, Carolyn just ups the ante here and becomes more obsessed with this guy.
So police are investigating this murder, and Paul and Carolyn are the primary suspects. And as they continue their investigations, all these secrets start coming out. All the lies, all the sex, it's just a big mess.
Paul is beginning to think, this is too much for me, and he breaks it off with her. You don't break up with Carolyn. She will not accept that. In fact, when you break up with her, she wants you more.
Breakups and rejections are a big issue for Carolyn, bringing up all her insecurities built up from a very young age.
Paul eventually meets another woman and starts dating her, and this just escalates the situation.
To add fuel to the fire, Paul starts dating a fellow teacher, Barbara Baller, and the two of them plan a very romantic trip to Puerto Rico. And this is a big issue for Carolyn. She stalks them all the way to Puerto Rico, uninvited.
They go on vacation. There's Carolyn lurking in the bushes, lurking in a hotel. At one point, she even impersonates a police officer.
Paul and Barbara say that Carolyn actually called a member of Barbara's family, pretending to be a police officer and making disparaging remarks in an effort to end their marriage. So clearly, this is not rational behavior. Carolyn is really starting to come unhinged, and that raises a red flag for police.
As the focus moves to Carolyn, they begin to look at her life. And what do they find? Well, they find this private investigator, 𝗠𝘂𝗿𝗱𝗲𝗿.
Let's remember that Carolyn is also dating other people while she's dating Paul, and one of those people is Vincent 𝗠𝗂𝗿𝗏. So police question 𝗠𝗂𝗏.
𝗠𝗂𝗏 has information. He says, look, I can give you something big, but I need a deal. I need to cut myself out of this.
Police go for it. They offer him a deal in exchange for information.
𝗠𝗂𝗏 testified under immunity that he furnished Carolyn Williams with a .25 caliber handgun and a silencer. Apparently she, according to 𝗠𝗂𝗏, paid him several $1,000s for the weapon.
He admits that he gave Carolyn a gun and a silencer. Wow. Now that puts the focus entirely on her.
But hey, pump the brakes. Police are taking 𝗠𝗂𝗏 at his word here, and he made sure he had an immunity deal before he told them anything. So this is not a Good Samaritan situation. 𝗠𝗂𝗏 made sure he didn't take any heat for any of this.
You know, whenever you're dealing with witnesses who testify under immunity, you've always got to be suspicious. It seemed that he had a lot to hide. It seemed that he had a lot of reasons to cooperate with the prosecution. Was Carolyn Williams the kind of person who would physically beat up, pistol whip, and then shoot 9 times another person? And that always seemed to be a very, very large question mark in the case.
So when 𝗠𝗂𝗏 tells police that Carolyn acquired this gun shortly before Betty Jean's murder, police start to take a closer look at Carolyn's phone records. And what they discover is a phone call made on January 15, the day of the murder.
Carolyn Williams' phone records listed a call made at 3:02 p.m. the day of the murder. The call was to Ray's Sports Shop. Police obtained store records that indicated the only female to purchase .25 caliber ammunition that day was a woman named Lisa Katai, who resided in Long Island. When questioned by investigators, Lisa Katai denied buying the ammunition.
Ray's sports shop is in the state of New Jersey. Not only is this woman denying buying the bullets, but she's saying, look, I'm from Long Island, New York. I didn't buy any bullets. I didn't go to a gun shop. I wasn't even in the state of New Jersey. So while police did not have all the answers at this point, they felt that they had enough information and evidence to make a move. Carolyn's indicted on second-degree murder and second-degree criminal possession of a weapon. But shortly after, her millionaire father posts her $250,000 bail.
Yes, she's been arrested, but we have to now look at the evidence and see exactly who committed this crime. Carolyn, Paul, or both.
Did the other boyfriend, 𝗠𝘂𝗿𝗲𝗿, have something to do with it? He seemed eager to come forward with information against Carolyn, and even more eager to demand immunity.
Could Carolyn, a petite woman, have done that? Could she have kicked in the door, barged in there, and pistol whipped this woman and then shot her? Or was this a more masculine crime? They know that it is tied to that affair. They just don't know how.
And again, she denies it, and no weapon was ever located.
Police know that Paul and Carolyn were having an affair, and they knew that the night of the murder, Paul and Carolyn had met up in some parking lot somewhere to have sex. So they're looking at all the evidence, sex, lies, murder, and they know there's a connection. They're trying to find a way to connect the dots.
Paul and Carolyn had sex. So either Paul knew his wife was murdered and then had sex with Carolyn, or Carolyn knew the wife was murdered and had sex with Paul. Either way you look at it, we're talking about two people who really have no moral compass whatsoever, and one of them is a sociopath.
I wouldn't have been surprised if they convicted, and I wouldn't have been surprised if they acquitted.
This is not an open and shut case for the prosecution. We know that Carolyn got that gun, but we don't know that she pulled the trigger. There's nothing that proves she pulled the trigger.
There was no forensic evidence. There was no eyewitness. There was no weapon.
What it really boils down to is that this is a purely circumstantial case, and the only two testimonies come from Carolyn's two ex-lovers, who are both granted immunity.
I don't think the evidence was overwhelming or clear-cut. A lot of it was circumstantial. A lot of it hinged on testimony from cooperating witnesses who had reasons to lie. Whether 𝗠𝘂𝗿𝗏 and Paul Soloman were testifying truthfully is always a difficult question for the jury, especially since they got immunity.
One of the really interesting things about this case is that Paul and Vincent both agreed to cooperate with police if they received immunity. And Carolyn, well, she maintained her innocence the entire time, and she claimed that she was framed for Betty Jean's murder.
What we have is a home invasion with really no forensics, no trace evidence, no fingerprints, no witness seeing somebody lurking in the neighborhood. What we have is a lot of suspicion about a husband and his mistress, but no proof. This all causes what? Reasonable doubt. Juries need that smoking gun evidence, and it's just not here.
The trial lasted for 3 months, and after 12 days of deliberations, the jury could not reach a unanimous vote. And without a unanimous vote, the judge could not hand down a guilty verdict. And on April 27th, 1991, he declared a mistrial. A new trial date is set, but really what the prosecution needs now is new information or new evidence. Otherwise, if Carolyn did do it, she's going to get away with murder.
So what happens at trial? Well, Carolyn walks free. How? A mistrial. It's a non-verdict, really. What it does is open up the possibility for the prosecution to retry the case. And that's exactly what they do.
The fact that the jury hung, I think they hung 8-4 for conviction, I can't say I was surprised.
A year later, in January of 1992, Carolyn goes to trial a second time.
What happens in the second trial is interesting because some new substantial evidence comes to light. And it's not only the new evidence, it's where it comes from.
In January, Carolyn Warmis's former lover, Paul Soloman, was asked to search again for evidence for the new trial. According to court records, he gave prosecutors a glove that he said was tucked away in a box in his bedroom closet. Forensic tests turned up hard-to-see finger-shaped human bloodstains on one of the gloves.
Paul claims that he was cleaning up his house one day, because he still lives in the same house where his wife was murdered, and he's moving some boxes around. What does he find? Lo and behold, a bloody glove.
There are a few things about this glove that are really conspicuous. First, the only person who's claiming that this is in fact Carolyn's glove is Paul. There is no real proof here.
And he hands it over to investigators, and investigators think, this is Carolyn's glove. This ties Carolyn to the crime scene and to this murder.
The prosecution was arguing that the bloody glove belonged to Carolyn Warmis. You'd think that the police had done a really competent job of investigating the murder scene, and they would have found all evidence that might have had telltale signs on it for forensic testing, and a bloody glove is pretty prominent. In fact, in a photograph at the murder scene, there is apparently a photo of a bloody glove somewhere in the scene. What's interesting, though, is that bloody glove was never tested. If you have a bloody glove at the scene of a murder, you'd think that the bloody glove would be tested for DNA evidence, and it might link the glove to the killer.
There should be Carolyn's DNA all over this damn glove, but no one tests it?
The first go-around, the glove appears in pictures at the crime scene. Then poof, it's gone, nowhere to be found. Carolyn goes to trial and the jury is hung. Then Paul just happens to find the glove right before the second trial. Not only that, but it happens to fill a void in the prosecution's case: physical evidence. What's totally mind-boggling is no DNA testing was done at all, not even during the second trial.
If I'm a defense attorney, that's the first thing I'm bringing up when they start bringing this glove into the trial is, well, why didn't you test it?
It was her glove, according to the evidence, and that evidence was not refuted.
The new physical evidence, the glove, is added to the prosecution's case, and it's really just added to all the other evidence that was presented in the first trial.
The most damning piece of circumstantial evidence was the alleged phone call made from Carolyn Warmis's home telephone to a gun shop in New Jersey the day of the killing. And then testimony from the gun shop in New Jersey that a woman came in and purchased a box of .25 caliber ammunition the day that Betty Jeanne Soloman was killed with 9 gunshots from a .25 caliber gun.
We have the glove, and we have the ammunition.
Well, the gun shop knows that the person produced a driver's license, and the driver's license was registered to a woman named Lisa 𝗂𝗿𝗏. Now, Lisa 𝗂𝗏𝗏 said, I never went to New Jersey and I never bought any cartridges.
As part of the investigation, it's revealed that 𝗂𝗏𝗏's driver's license was either lost or stolen during a summer job. One of her co-workers on that summer job just happened to be Carolyn Warmis.
That's a kind of a fascinating conglomeration. Reasonable jurors could draw the inference that Carolyn Warmis made the phone call to this gun shop the day of the killing, went to the gun shop with Lisa 𝗂𝗏𝗏's driver's license, bought the cartridges, and used the cartridges in her weapon that she got from Vincent Parco.
We have Carolyn tied to that ammunition by stealing a co-worker's ID and buying it from a gun shop.
To me, that may be the most critical evidence in the trial. Now, you have a different jury. You have additional evidence.
Is that all circumstantial, or is that the factual evidence that this jury needs to convict her? Well, in this case, it was enough.
Her sentence was 25 to life. The judge could have imposed the minimum of 15 to life, but he decided to make it 25 years to life.
This case is called the Fatal Attraction case because it was really happening in real time while the Glenn Close, Michael Douglas movie Fatal Attraction was released. So the media latched onto this.
You have this very attractive young woman. You have this relationship with a married man, and then the wife is viciously killed. There were similarities, and it was just such a coincidence that the Fatal Attraction film was popular at the time.
I see a sociopath who cannot let go of romance. I see a woman who, every time a boyfriend rejects her, she has to act out. And it's generally not on the guy, it's on somebody else. In this case, we have a poor, innocent housewife who did nothing to nobody, who was brutally murdered. And Carolyn is the person who did it. There's no doubt about it. And Carolyn can point to Paul all damn day long. All the evidence in this case points to one person, and that is Carolyn Warmis.
When they asked her, do you think it was Paul? She said, it couldn't be Paul. I would never think that Paul would do this. Who did it? She doesn't know. She said she didn't make the call. She said she doesn't know if the call was made, and she didn't make it. I think she's thinking that somebody framed her. That's her theory, that somebody framed her.
Throughout this entire investigation and both trials, Carolyn always maintained her innocence, and she said that she was framed. And her defense claimed that it was very suspicious that both testifying witnesses were granted immunity. Not only does Paul have immunity, but he conveniently finds the glove as evidence a year later. I'd say the timing is a bit suspicious.
Carolyn Warmis was incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. In 2004, Warmis filed a lawsuit against the New York State Department of Correctional Services, alleging rape and sexual abuse by prison guards. In 2008, Warmis received a $10,000 settlement from the Department of Correctional Services in regard to her lawsuit.
Sounds like Carolyn is having a really rough go in prison. She claims to have been raped, which is substantiated because she receives a reward settlement. Then, in 2006, her parole is denied. Imagine Carolyn was actually framed for the killing of Betty Jeanne Soloman. She's spending years in jail. She's beaten. She's raped. It's horrific. Then, she's diagnosed with a brain tumor and holds off on having surgery in the hopes of getting parole.
She's ill right now. I think that, there are reasons to parole her from the standpoint of her health, from the standpoint of the fact that she served so many years in jail already. Parole is always a tough question, especially for the family of the victim.
The parole board also mentioned that Carolyn said she would not apologize for a crime she did not commit, and that also worked against her.
When people don't admit their guilt, the parole authorities are much more reluctant to grant parole.
This is really a sensational case, and in a lot of ways, it became a media spectacle.
It seemed to fit just perfectly for the media to exploit the public's craving for this type of story.
The media is truly a powerful force. It has the ability to influence a case in either direction, and the public needs answers and a resolution in a case like this one. So does that mean that the media interfered in this case? It's hard to say.
You have this idyllic couple, married with a kid, living in suburbia, and everything seems happy, but then you have this lunatic, crazy, sociopath, obsessed lover, willing to stop at nothing, including murder, to get her man.
It has all of these elements that I guess the public gets fascinated about. You've got sex, you've got a vicious, horrible murder, you've got a murder of your lover's wife. I mean, killing your lover's wife to get total control of your lover, that's a pretty extraordinary event.
The tumor left her with vision problems and paralysis on one side of her face. Carolyn ended up having the surgery in the first part of 2018, but she still requires more treatment.
In July 2018, Carolyn Warmus requested postponement of her parole hearing as she continued to battle the effects of her brain tumor. According to her legal representation, Warmus is currently awaiting the court's decision on another appeal filed to overturn her 1992 murder conviction.
Carolyn has maintained her innocence throughout this entire thing, but if Paul Soloman or Vincent Parco had anything to do with the murder, they can't be indicted because they were granted immunity. So if one of them is guilty, they really played their cards right because they're sitting at home and she's rotting in prison.
What happened in that room is something that only the killer knows. Who is the killer? Is it Carolyn Warmus? She strongly denies it. Let's put it this way. We know she was convicted. The jury found her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but we'll never know for certain whether Carolyn Warmus was the killer.
After a while, is the 50 km/h speed control section. There is a speed bump on the front.